Right away. Thank you.
He's so
well worth it. It only takes Bitcoin.
I am liking.
Luckily Irish.
Luckily Irish.
Top of the evening.
Our first panel is old friends. We've called our panel Old Friends of Hal, who've traveled from far away to come share their thoughts about Hal Varian. So we have Bob Hall, Richard Such, Don Lamb, and Tom Russell. And I guess we'll just start at this end with Richard. Is that all right?
Yes.
And I will give you the mic. So let's give a warm welcome first to our panelists.
This is a panel on old friends, and as I was thinking about what to say, I did the obvious thing, which was to think about when I first met Hal back in Berkeley when I was a professor and he was a student in the late 60s, early 70s. But that's nothing from that era seemed very memorable, which may be a reflection on my relationship with Hal, but it may just be a reflection on my memory. So as I was thinking about something more exciting to say, I was driving around in the car the other day, and same time I was listening to National Public Radio, and they were interviewing some business professor about why Snap shares should be worth $47. And that reminded me of a paper that Hal wrote in 2001. Now that paper compared the for-profit rental book market of the late 18th and early 19th century with the commercial video rental market of the late 70s and early 80s. And why that Snapchat chat reminded me of that paper. I have to read you the conclusion of the paper. By the way, if you're interested in this paper, dare I say it, you can Google it. It's up there on the web. Just type in Hal's name and something like the video market and it'll pop up. So the conclusion of this paper was the initial market for both items, that's books and video tapes, was available only to the rich. The development of the rental market helped to spread the material to the masses, and at the same time stimulated the masses to acquire the necessary equipment and or skills to take advantage of the availability of the materials. In the case of videos, it was a video machine itself. In the case of reading, it was the ability to read. In each case, the industry was driven by the availability of erotic content. See the Snapchat connection? But the widespread literacy and light entertainment also laid groundwork for a more substantial material. The other thing I wanted to point out is that to be an old friend, you have to be an old friend. And I think you'll agree that it's very hard to keep old friends over a long period of time. And particularly if you're talking about someone as peripatetic as Hal, who after he left Berkeley was at Stanford, MIT, Michigan, Berkeley again, Google, and in between there he was in Stockholm, Helsinki, Oxford, Melbourne, etc. And so actually over these many years, we were only in the same town occasionally. But what I think is the glue to a long-term relationship like this is the care and compassion and respect and even love that Hal put into his friendships and relationships. And I should mention that this paper that I just wrote about, I mentioned to you, about erotic content, was co-written by another colleague of mine, Richard Rail. Now, Richard Rail was a medievalist and a specialist in these long ago markets for books and the like. And Richard Rail would also classify as an old friend, but unfortunately he died about a year and a half ago. But if he hadn't died, he'd be up here. And one of you wouldn't.
Which one?
And I mention this because when Richard Rail was in the hospital, Hal went out of his way to visit, to help support his wife. After Richard died, Hal came up to Santa Rosa, where his wife lives, and helped her unlock her husband's laptop because he never gave her the passwords to all of his programs. So Hal also is an accomplished hacker. But the story to me just tells you how good a friend he's been, that we could keep this long sustained relationship alive.
Okay, so Richard and I were classmates at MIT, and we both started teaching at Berkeley together, and therefore we met. Yeah. Oh, this is Bob Hall. So we met as kids. He was a kid graduate student, and I was a kid assistant professor. And he asked my advice about what to do in graduate school, and I said, there's one thing you've got to do, and that's learn McFadden. And that period in my life was just an amazing sort of second graduate school. I went to a good graduate school, but I got the equal as a kid kid assistant professor at Berkeley under the leadership of Dan. So then I moved to MIT in 1970, and Hal came on the job market, I think in 72 or 73, one or the other. And he gave the most amazing job market talk. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time presenting the paper that he gave. But instead, I'll refer you to page 67 of the paper, Theorem 2.1. If X is a strongly efficient allocation, then there is some agent that envies no one, and there is some agent that no one envies. And I remember just being stunned by that result, and the way he presented it. It went down as the best. I'm insulting other people in this room, but it was the best job market talk I ever went to. It was just incredible. And the clarity of his mind and his ability to present was just off the scale. So then I benefited enormously from my affiliation with Hal at that time. Now, he has many talents, but there's probably one I know about that I haven't, that probably has not come up again, won't come up again, and that he was an outstanding bicycle mechanic. And you remember this, right? So he came over and helped me with, this was when 10 speeds had just come out, and he showed me how to take my 10 speed apart and put it back together right. And it worked for a long time after that. It was a pretty amazing machine. So now fast forward to 2005. Of course, a lot of things happened in Hal's life, including losing his entire library in a fire. And Hal appeared in Menlo Park with a sign that says, "We'll work for food." And well, that was good because we had an opening at home for a dinner companion. And ever since then, he comes over for dinner. You probably know he has this unusual life of spending 3 or 4 nights a week in Menlo Park, actually not far from our house. But this has been a perfect relationship ever since then, in which he works for food.
Was he at the bottom of the corner?
Yes, it was a cardboard sign, exactly. And he's done that continuously while he's kept his day job at Google. So we're hoping for another 50 great years of Hal.
I'm Tom Russell, and I'm probably going to read this.
Elizabeth and I first met Hal in the late 1960s, which is amazingly enough almost 50 years ago. I was in grad school in Berkeley, and I suppose the first question you might ask is, what was it like to be in class with Hal? And I have to say I can't answer that question, because I was never in class with Hal. And I think the reason for that, I'm not quite sure what the reason was, but I think the reason was that somehow or other Hal skipped the whole first year or something. Is that right? I don't know what happened. Anyway, I was spared the blow to my self-respect of having to take exams with the person who was about to write the standard textbook on graduate microeconomics. Well, so I can't talk about what it was like to be in class with Hal, but you might say, well, what was it like? What was Hal like otherwise? And I'd like to just now cite a mathematical theorem, which I'm going to call the invariance theorem, because really Hal has not changed in 50 years. In fact, he hasn't really changed physically in 50 years. And if you look at the photograph which invited us to this event, you could ask, well, when was that picture taken? Was it a year ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? It is quite remarkable. But what I mean by saying that Hal hasn't changed in 50 years is that his traits have not really changed in 50 years. 50 years ago, Hal was as much interested in computers as he is now. And 50 years ago, there was a movie which was a great success called 2001: A Space Odyssey. And the name of the computer in that movie, which is it's an evil computer, but this is not my point. The name of the computer in that movie was HAL. And one of my graduate student colleagues said, you know, what happened was Stanley Kubrick met Hal Varian. Well, I mean, everyone in this room knows that that's absolute nonsense. There's another reason why that computer is called HAL. But if I was a movie director and I was looking to name a computer, I think I might want to call it HAL. The second trait I want to talk about from those days, Hal then and now, is that Hal then was extraordinarily well organized, as I think he still is now. In those days, on Friday evenings, the graduate students would go out for dinner to a Chinese restaurant. And my graduate student classmate, Bill Taylor, used to describe, because financially we were in different circumstances then, he used to describe it as 12 graduate students with enough food for 6. And in that ordering process, we always relied on Hal to do the ordering. He had his magic notebook and he said, we need a chicken, we need a fish, we need this, we'll get too much of this, too much. And to this day, I still rely on Hal when I'm in a Chinese restaurant to do the ordering for me. The final trait of Hal that I'd like to mention, Hal then and now, is one which you might not think is quite so obvious. And that is that Hal then and Hal now is a huge risk taker. Now, I mean, that might strike you as being odd, but Bob Hall has already mentioned one of Hal's enormous risks, which was his thesis. Hal's thesis was only 40 pages long, and it consisted in discussing the intersection between mathematical economics and philosophy, which was not an area which is guaranteed to lead to a perfect job in the job market. That was a risk. It's a risk that worked out, as Professor Hall said. It was one of the best job market papers he'd ever heard. But it's still a risk to do something like that. The second risk I'd like to talk about just very briefly is the risk involved in Hal's famous graduate textbook. I was in Berkeley, and of course in Berkeley, graduate microeconomics, thanks to Professor McFadden and Sidney Winter and the rest of my life, Bob Hall, was taught in a very special way. And I know how special that was because after I left Berkeley, I went to England and I talked about Berkeley microeconomics, and no one knew what I was talking about. So it was very much centered on Berkeley and had not spread from the Berkeley fold. When Hal wrote that textbook, therefore, he was definitely breaking the mold of what a graduate microeconomics textbook should look like. That was taking a risk. Now, I imagine I have to also thank the gentleman on my right, who was involved with that textbook, for, in fact, publishing that risk. But it was a risk taken and a risk, of course, that worked out. And when risks work out, you don't realize that they are risks. the final risk I want to mention is Hal now. And that is the risk that Hal took by leaving academia and going to work for Google. Now, I remember being on a hike with Hal one day when he said, you know, I'm thinking of leaving academia full time and going to work for Google. And I thought, Hal, are you nuts? But what would you do there? And he said, I'd be the chief economist. I said, what the hell is that? Now, of course, today, many non-financial companies have chief economists. But once again, it was Hal who broke the mold. So, I mean, it's not obvious that Hal is a risk taker, but he has taken many risks. Now, one thing that Hal does not take risks with, I would say, and one of the reasons why the pictures look the same is, I wouldn't say that Hal takes a lot of risk in his dress. In fact, I think my guess is that he's wearing pretty much the same stuff that he wore those 50 years ago. But all of that said, I should say that from the point of Elizabeth and myself, it has been the greatest of pleasures to have known you for these 50 years, then to have known Carol, and then to have known Chris. And it's a great honor to be here and a great pleasure to have made this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Don Lamb. I suppose I'm the very definition of a very old friend. It's hard to figure out what is worse, speaking before dinner when people are hungry, or speaking after dinner when they're sleepy. So the only thing I can say in both cases, keep it brief. So I won't tell you very much about our first meeting, because others have alluded to this, but there was this lanky professor, not quite as lanky as he is now, assistant professor at MIT. I was lankier also. And he had this manuscript that was utterly incomprehensible to me, called Notes on Microeconomics. We talked a while, and I decided it wouldn't be the first economics book I had anything to do with that I couldn't understand. So off we went, and we published it. But I'm not going to talk about that. It did become a very successful book. Right. No, instead, I want to say also about a second meeting, which was at Berkeley. I'm sorry, it was at Michigan, where Hal introduced me to the wonders of his computer. In fact, took me on a virtual tour of a museum in Florence, Italy, and asked what I'd like to see. I said, well, I'm not planning to go there. He said, no, I'll bring it up for you. And sure enough, he brought up a 15th century map of Florence, just as clearly as possible, out of an exhibition that was taking place there. So I don't want to talk about that either, at least anymore. But I do want to say a few words about how not taking Hal seriously, or as seriously as I should have, left me as a semi-impoverished publisher. It happened one day in his office at Berkeley, the dean's office, and he mentioned to me that he was spending a few days a week with two former graduate students from Stanford down there, and he tried to explain exactly what this was all about. I knew it was a startup, but I didn't understand anything else about it, other than the fact that it was quite obvious that these fellows were able to retrieve a trove of information from it seemed to me, a very simplistic way, which is they just had more electrical sockets and more plugs than most other people. Hal said, it's a little more complicated than that. So that was my first awareness that there was yet a new life springing for Hal. But then I really had a second chance, because Hal told me that this new firm, Google, was planning to go public. And he tried desperately to explain to me the intricacies of a Dutch auction. Now, the only thing that occurred to me was that sometime in the 17th century, when the Dutch were riding high, there was, of course, this big tulip bubble. And it expanded and expanded, and finally, of course, as all bubbles, it expired. So I thought, no, I'm not going near that one. Another bubble. The only thing I can really say in addition was that when Hal had this early experience down there at Stanford with these two former graduate students, I had to ask him the obvious question: how in the world are they paying you? And he modestly asserted, oh, they'll give me a few shares in the company. I thought, this highly sophisticated man surely has fallen into a trap. Now, so I cannot really say more than that. It's been wonderful to see Hal in every venue that I've cited. And I'm just happy to be here on his coming of age. It's about time. Happy birthday, Hal.
Thank you to that panel. Let's give another round of applause. Please step down. All right. Before the Michigan panel, we're going to have a special solo speaker from Jonathan Rosenberg.
Yes.
My last name is Rosenberg, and for the economists in the audience, if you recognize the name, if you take the J-O in front of Jonathan, you get Nathan. Nathan Rosenberg was my father. So I've been working with Hal for the last 15 years, and I want to go back to the start of that. Back in 2002, Eric Schmidt asked me to find a real economist, as opposed to me. I majored in economics. You know, someone who gets the internet and understands how to analyze auctions. And we actually later formalized what we called that. We called it the physics of clicks. I didn't know that 15 years later I would be at Hal's 70th birthday party calling him the Albert Einstein of digital clicks. But back in 2002, I went and hunted for an economist that got it. You know, somebody who I could present to Eric and Larry and Sergey. And I found an article in the Industry Standard. It was from March of 2000. It was called The Law of Recombinant Growth. And in lovely Hal language, it likened the opportunities of the internet to those that were faced by Eli Whitney, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, and other inventors. And it said that today's inventors have learned that the sum is greater than the parts. Hal Varian wrote, quote, "The web components, URLs, CGI scripts, HTTP protocols, and the HTML language hold the seeds of similar innovation. In the fertile grounds of research labs and startups, people are taking apart and recombining these basic elements to forge new products, services, processes, and business models." And Hal went on, I won't read the rest, but he presciently offered a foundation for how the tools of innovation would be democratized into digital building blocks. The things that allow today's startups to basically build a product, host it on Amazon or Google, distribute it through someone else's Play Store, test it, market it through Twitter or Facebook, and make money by leveraging the platforms that were built by others. So think about this. Back in 2000, when Hal wrote this, all those activities would have to be done from scratch by any startup. Today, we have Angry Birds, we have Pokemon Go, we have Snapchat, and these things scale from an app to a global phenomena basically by recombining the web components. Exactly as Hal predicted. Pretty good. So Hal also taught me two other important economic rules. Hal Varian 101, Carl Shapiro probably knows this as well, rules that drive product development and career choices. Rule number one, information. Information is expensive to produce and cheap to reproduce. Basically the notion of a non-rival good. It doesn't get used up. So you think about this: news, traffic, business ratings, information about things that people have to buy and sell. This concept basically drove all internet strategy over the last 15 years. Hal, rule number 2, this is career advice. Jonathan, when you grow up, you want to be a complementary scarce resource. Like, whatever that is. What is that? That is actually the career advice that allowed Hal to declare the CEO of the company, Dr. Eric Schmidt, sexy. Because he then wrote, computer engineers were the sexy job of the 1990s. Good job kissing up. Hal then said the sexy job in the next 10 years will be statisticians. If you actually paid attention to Hal, you understood why Bill Gates said the cost of computing is going down. I'm going to work on software. For the last 15 years, data became ubiquitous, and what did Hal do? He made statistics sexy. So back in 2002, I'm assigned to get this brilliant economist, Hal Varian, on a contract with Google. And we made a proposal for like what he was going to do for us, right? Well, he was going to analyze the theory of position auctions. He was going to build an auto-regressive forecasting model, revise our query forecasting for seasonal components, do partner cannibalization on syndication. We successfully cannibalized all of that, as I recall. And conversion tracking analysis, lifetime value of advertisers, RPM-based country forecasting, all sorts of stuff that sounded impressive. And of course, to just get the proposal, Hal had to actually dig into our numbers and learn a little bit about Google. So he says, yeah, I'm okay being paid in Google stock. And I figure, I'm a good negotiator, I'll outsmart him. You know, fractions are difficult for people. So I'll present a really generous numerator representing what an important fancy economist should get paid. But I'm really going to sock it to him on the denominator. And I'm going to quote him a really inflated rate for Google shares. So I gave him the big numerator, and I threw out, you know, Hal, $10 per Google share is what we're going to divide that big number by. This was like about 2 to the n splits ago. And Hal sort of does the math in his head, and he sort of walks over to me in that sort of 6'7" avuncular professorial type of way, and looks at me like I'm the student that hasn't caught up with him yet, and says, Jonathan, I accept. So 15 years later, I'm left wondering, like, who got the better deal? Right? Google, by virtue of the value that Hal added to our auction, or Hal? Well, there's one more economic rule that Hal taught me. It was one of his favorites. It was a rule set forth by Milton Friedman. Quote, most economic fallacies derive from the tendency to assume there's a fixed pie, that one party can only gain at the expense of the other. So in retrospect, Hal, the Albert Einstein of digital clicks, again correctly predicted the future. Turns out the pie sliced up pretty good for all parties. Happy birthday, Hal.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that wonderful laudation from Google. That was kind of the official Google thank you to Hal. And now we're going to have the Michigan Days panel. So we'll have Severin, Roger, and Ted. Could hopefully, oh good, Severin's here. And is Roger Gordon here? Excellent. And Ted, I know you have a presentation here which I will bring up. All right. So why don't you go third while I bring that up afterwards. So Severin, why don't you go first?
Okay.
And Roger, and then Ted.
Thank you. And Marty, thank you for inviting me to participate. And Hal, thank you for all the influences on my life from the time I met Hal. In 1983, I was a new assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and Hal was one of my senior colleagues, not too senior. early on, I was told that there was one event I had to attend during the fall semester, which was the Stroh's Bats conference. For those of you who never attended this conference, this was a conference that was set up by the faculty at each of at the University of Western Ontario and the University of Michigan, and the visiting faculty brought with them a case of the home brew, although much more than just one case was consumed at the time. This conference was actually created by one of the two individuals to my right, but I'll let you guess which one. So on the drive up there with Hal seemingly randomly started speculating on who might win the Nobel Prize. It was 1983. And he sort of threw out the name, Gerard Debreu might win the Nobel Prize. And I thought, really? So at this time, the Nobel had been given, this was 83, it was originally started in 69. So there were a lot of really famous economists who had not received the Nobel Prize. And although Gerard Debreu was truly one of them, I figured, what are the chances of that? So I said, well, maybe, but I think it's unlikely. And Hal said, well, I'll make you a bet. So I said, surely I'm going, what's the chances Debreu gets it among all the people who haven't gotten it yet? Sure. So we made a bet. I recall it was $5, which is 100 today. And this was early October. We went to the conference. One of the people on this panel was the leader of the beer drinking. And we drove back, and a week or so later, the Nobel Prize came out, and sure enough, it was Gerard Debreu. And I thought, wow, what are the chances? And so I went to pay Hal his $5, and Hal said, well, actually, when the Nobel Committee decides who's going to receive it, they contact someone to write up the Nobel statement that would go out when this person, and they had contacted Hal Varian. So Hal at that time taught me a lot about asymmetric information. I, of course, said, well, that's great, Hal, but, I shouldn't have to pay you the money. And Hal also taught me about binding commitments. So as a junior faculty member at Michigan, Hal was a great inspiration. He was actually a fabulous colleague. I learned a tremendous amount of economics from him. Hal's office, actually in both buildings that I was in with him, was always had its door open. He was almost always there. And in both cases, his office was situated in a location that as you were moving through the building, it was hard not to walk by, which was great. It was great to see Hal, but there was this danger because often you would walk by and a voice would come out of his office that, in my case, would say, hey, Sev, want to see something neat? So Hal had gotten a new computer, of course, well before the rest of us. When the rest of us were sharing PCs in the early 80s, Hal had his own. When the rest of us finally had our own, Hal had the first hard disk in the department, and so forth. And the danger was that Hal's demonstrations, and I think one of the previous speakers mentioned this, were not 3-minute demonstrations. So you could lose an entire afternoon of research time when Hal decided that he wanted to show you something neat. But it was always something very neat, and frequently had nothing to do with economics, but Hal was a tech guy from the beginning. The last part of this computer envy came, this was probably around, so Chris was born 87, so 89-ish, towards the end of my time at Michigan, I went over to Hal's house, and Chris was playing on a computer, and I noticed that this was actually Hal's hand-me-down computer, and Chris, at age 2, had a nicer computer than I did. I learned a lot about economics from Hal. I learned a lot about computers from Hal. It wasn't until I met my wife in Michigan and Margaret met Hal that I learned the phrase that, for me, captures everything about Hal, and about his joy in what he's doing, about his willingness to bring everyone in on what he's doing and the fun. And it was Margaret who first said, you know, Hal really loves being Hal. And it's absolutely true. It's just always fun because Hal is having a good time, and as a result, even when it's a hard problem or a difficult discussion, it's fun because Hal's making it fun. Happy birthday, Hal.
Marty asked us to talk about Hal's time at Michigan, but I actually met Hal more than a decade before then. When he arrived as a new assistant professor at MIT, I was a PhD student then. At the time, the teaching of core micro to PhD students at MIT was in turmoil. 2 years before I arrived, the first year class was so unhappy with the courses they were taking that they, as a group, dropped out of these classes, even though they were required for a PhD. And the faculty couldn't flunk out the whole class. And so they were forced to jerry-rig some topics courses quickly to calm the students down. And that was the state of the classes I faced as well as a first-year PhD student. But the real solution didn't occur until Hal arrived, bringing with him the first drafts of what became his graduate textbook. And this really rescued the teaching of micro at MIT, and soon enough spread to the rest of the profession as well. After we both left MIT, Hal for Michigan, and eventually I was at Bell Laboratories, we still kept in regular touch. And I will never forget a phone call I got from Hal the day after Christmas in, I think it was 1981, in part to wish me happy holidays. But the real reason for his call is to tell me that the economics building at Michigan had burned down to the ground the previous day, and Hal was suddenly realizing he had no copies of any of his past research, not even a copy of the CV. Everything had been consumed in the fire. And he asked me to send him a copy of any of his past work, and hopefully I had a copy of his CV as well. In fact, it was true. Hal had been very prolific, and I very much liked Hal's work, and I had a very thick file of Hal papers, and fortunately a copy of his CV also. Maybe a little bit out of date, but reasonably up to date. So could send these to him. During this period as well, Hal was encouraging me to think about moving to Michigan. And Hal was one of my favorite people as well as one of my favorite economists, so this is something I very much wanted to consider. My wife at that point was teaching at NYU, and she's very much a city person. And so that was the challenge. So Hal invited us out to Ann Arbor and was trying to convince us that Ann Arbor could provide all the amenities that we had grown to like in New York City without all the hassles of living there. So one strategy he took was to bring us out to his favorite Indian restaurant. Unfortunately, that didn't compare with what we do from MIT, and that put off discussions for a year or two. But he brought us back. He kept at it. I much appreciate that. And brought us to his favorite, now Afghan restaurant. Well, that we did like. And it was hard to find Afghan food in New York, so not only could it replicate it, bettered at least some of the experiences we had there, and we did move. Now, adjusting to life in Ann Arbor was a challenge. We had both spent our entire lives on the East Coast, living in communities of mostly recent immigrants. Faculty at the schools we had known were majority immigrants, and in New York universities almost entirely. At Michigan, not only were most of the faculty native to the US, but they were native to the Midwest. Hal grew up on a farm in Ohio, Ted on a farm in Minnesota. And to us, coming from the East Coast, this was far more exotic than having colleagues from, say, Burma and Namibia, which we had in the past. Now, Hal had many things he was enthusiastic about. While the Indian restaurant was not one we shared, others were spot on. One he was very excited about was a new bookstore in town that had a much longer set of titles it carried and worked hard to have a very knowledgeable staff. This bookstore, it's called Borders, soon enough became a national chain. And another thing that Hal quickly fell in love with was the first IBM PC. It's a computer with no hard disk, 2 floppy disks, one for the operating system, one to try to fit on what you were working on. The rest of us thought this was simply an expensive toy, but Hal saw the potential of this and convinced the department to buy several of them to be shared among the faculty. So each was on a cart, and if you wanted to do word processing, you'd wander the halls, find a cart, and bring it back to your office and do the work. Hal also fell in love with tech as a word processing program to make this computer more useful. Now, he tried to convince the rest of us this was something we should also be using. The user manuals at that time for tech were anything but user-friendly. It's a real challenge to figure out how to do things with the manuals that existed then. But Hal was user-friendly. And so when we had questions, he was very patient with us, encouraging us in any way to shift our work to tech. One of the tricks he used was to add routines to replicate the typeface and page layout of articles published in all the major top journals. So when we issued working papers, they could look like they were reprints from the top journal of our choice. Hal also became sufficiently adept that he decided to do the typeface for later editions of his textbook with McGraw-Hill.
The wrong guy.
Was it Norton? Oh, sorry. Time?
Yeah.
All right, sorry. Fair enough. So I said, Hal made the department a very congenial place. I didn't mention that. It focused on his contributions to computer technology at Michigan, but I think that congeniality is something that I expect will be something that will be brought up by the faculty from the School of Information Technology and from Google, and I think this party reflects the appreciation that all of those who have known Hal over the years share.
Is it there? Yes. Slideshow there.
We can see it right here.
Yes, so I want to talk a little bit about, or some more about Hal's Ann Arbor days. For a start, here's where a lot of this happened. This was the old economics building in Ann Arbor. Photo taken about 1976, just before Hal arrived. Hold it up to my mouth. Okay. Yeah, I was holding it over here. always forget these things. Yeah. So, here's what it was like in economics before Hal. It was a very staid place. You can see word trickling in, and actually, I had arrived a couple of years before. I arrived, I think, in '74, so I'd leave in '75. When I reappeared, Hal had arrived, and so here we are. As you know, Hal actually is quite an accomplished amateur magician. He can be a real pain in the neck, in fact. There's a story, let's see, my son, when he was 6 and lost a tooth, we decided to really treat him, give him a silver dollar. The tooth fairy brought him a silver dollar. Hal comes over to the house. The son is so thrilled, he's so proud of his silver dollar. And he shows it to Hal. Hal, of course, there's Hal. Let me see it, let me see it. So Hal reaches out, palms the silver dollar. Face falls. And out of his ear comes the silver dollar. Which, actually my son still remembers that. In fact, nowadays admires Hal. Well, once Hal arrived, here's what happened. It was a new place. It was just not like it had been. It really had been rather a dull department. Here was this guy who was fun. Not only smart, but fun and enthusiastic. It made a tremendous difference, as you might imagine. Actually, this marijuana flag may surprise you. Hal's TAs would, remember Shaky Jake, Hal? So these were the days, when they really celebrated Hal's work. So I thought you might enjoy playing a little game of Where's Waldo? Can you find him? Pretty shy and tired guy, isn't he? Yeah, not this guy with the suit and so on. That guy went on to be, president of the university and then president of Princeton and all those things. That's what happens if you wear suits. But we could also do a little historical research here. Where was Waldo in 1976? He was at MIT. Can you find him? Yeah. He actually has changed a little bit, I guess, hasn't he? The other thing I'd like you to notice is, look at how many neckties there are with these MIT guys. Remember the Ann Arbor guys? Let's see, what do we got? We got.
Why are they all bags?
Why are they all bags? Yeah. Okay, well, this guy's an Englishman. He's excusable. He's a macroeconomist. That's probably excusable. He's a future university administrator, so you can understand that. He's a European. But a little different. In the Midwest, as Roger was remarking, evidently the dress is a little different too. So you might want to know where Hal lived when he first arrived in Ann Arbor. Here's Hal Varian. This is taken from Google Maps, of course. I actually wanted to do. Started to try to do. Let's take Hal and have him walk to the university following Street View. But I wasn't skillful enough to do it. I could do it, but it was pretty boring. You get the idea. That's what it looked like. Ann Arbor. Just down the street, by the way, was Hal's neighbor George, 2 doors down. George was a lot of fun. George, you see, would have he would have imaginary ideas about what his colleagues did, and so on. George called Hal Hot Tub Hal, and he would recount stories. George would recount stories. Some of them, I think, I don't know how accurate they were, but they're somewhat salacious stories about things that could happen in hot tubs. So, as has been mentioned, there is this tell-all book where you can find out pretty much what Hal did and what happens in hot tubs. We can understand how Tom Lamb didn't understand what was going on. I bet he hasn't been in a hot tub. So on the back flyleaf of there is Machina's version of the invariance principle. Mark Machina, the economist at San Diego, said, no matter what aspect of microeconomic theory a student happens to ask me about, I use the invariance principle. I just reply, it's invariance text. Well, I came across a New Zealander who had a variant on this principle. This is the New Zealand version. Whenever a student comes to me with a question about it, now, as you know, New Zealanders only have about 3 vowels, and A and E are indistinguishable. Well, we also had this popularized book by Hal. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a copy of the first edition cover, which was more elegant than this, in my opinion. The first edition actually had the best of the covers, and this one's better than most of them. Anyway, it was a pretty good book, you know, we thought. We used to teach from it. And then to go along with it, he and I wrote this compendium of jokes, which you know, people told us they were sophomoric jokes, and Hal, of course, explained that, well, we're selling it to sophomores. The truth is, the professors liked our jokes better than the students. Here's the back, from the back page, you can see the quality of the humor there. Not for actually, for the you know, there were some other. I remember that there was Norton was really wonderful to deal with in handling this book in general. There's one really subtle thing that they did. We had in there a fictitious city called Lake Witch's Tit, up in Minnesota, of course. And without any comment, it was transformed into Lake Which Is It? But there were lots of places. There was Brass Monkey, Ontario, I remember. There was this fellow, Edmund Stench. Edmund Stench made a living. He collected bottles and things like that, but he also would go to university meetings because he was able to sit in a dignified fashion without falling down for hours at a time, and so he would add to the audience. And there were lots of other people, Mary again, Granola, and so on. You see, Hal, one of the things about Hal loves jokes. And they don't have to be good jokes, really. And one of the things about it too, if you have a poor memory, Hal's jokes are great because he will tell them to you over and over. Well, here's where we had our lunches at the league dinner table, the round table. This is the annual Strohs-Labatt's conference that was mentioned, which was, I think, a joy for everybody who participated. The entire theory group from Western Ontario and from Ann Arbor would every year meet together, share a lot of beer, each of them explain what they were working on. Then we should tell you about Christmas Eve, 1980. There our building burned down, which was kind of exciting. The next morning, here's what it looked like. Up here, I think Hal's office was that one. Is that right, Hal? Second one? And what happened was everything in the second floor fell through to the basement. If I remember right, it later turned out that not everything of Hal's was destroyed because steel case file cabinets preserved the things in, and they were found in the basement, and so he has no excuses for not having been more productive. Let's see, so we were sent into exile in the St. Joseph's Hospital where we stayed for, I think our colleague George said, for the length of the World War II. Then, let's see, so how many of my minutes have I used?
24 seconds.
24 seconds, I got it. Okay, so of course, we all were excited about Hal had new ideas, new things to do. He taught us to use tech. He taught us to use computers. Was always, I soon learned that the way to handle this modern world, listen to that. The way to handle this modern world is to do what Hal does, which I did, followed him through next. We should have a look at Hal's later dwellings in Ann Arbor. He moved to a somewhat fancier house. He had trouble getting a loan on this, as I recall. There's a good story involved with that. There's our subsequent place. There is where we would have lunch when we were and so back in those days, we sure had a hell of a lot of fun.
Thank you to our panelists. That was wonderful. All three of you. All right. Our next panel before dinner. Oops, sorry. Our next panel before dinner is Infotech, and I want to point out, if you look at your programs, that during dinner we'll have an open mic, so that for those of you who were not asked on a formal panel, you'll be able to talk and say whatever you'd like to say as well. So let's bring up the Infotech panel, which is Carl Shapiro, Susan Athey, and Ben Hermelin.
I'll start. Since I'm slightly afraid this will not otherwise happen, I have a particular relationship with Marty Hurst that some of you may know about. I want to make sure we thank her for organizing this whole thing. And I'm sure she'll be quick to point out, with a lot of help from the Google folks and other people, but Marty really took the initiative here. I remember she said, let's do this. And I go, yeah, Hal's a close friend of mine. You should do it. And she did. So this is the designated topic, information economics, I think. But let me go back a little bit and work our way up to that, because actually Hal has done so many different things. It's not as though this was the field that he started with or did for many years. Came onto it a bit later, and I'll get to that. Now, I don't go back with Hal quite as long as some of the other people here, maybe because I'm not quite as old as some of them, although I'm plenty old myself. Oh, yes, okay, thank you. But I did meet Hal when I was an undergraduate at MIT. I was still in my teens. Hal was in his 20s. This is over 40 years ago. And some of you would know, most of you not, he was actually my undergraduate thesis advisor. So he was doing some sort of non-Walrasian equilibrium, and I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I was following along, and he was a great advisor, actually helped encourage me to go into economics. I was doing a lot of math at the time, so a lot of influence right there. In fact, how we share the fact that we both have undergraduate degrees at MIT and master's degrees in mathematics from UC Berkeley. Okay, we share a lot of other things. I'll get to that in a moment. So, and in fact, then right after that, Hal, you went and visited Berkeley, and I was a grad student there, and so I was the RA for the first edition actually of microeconomic analysis. So that was our beginning of our relationship. And then Hal was at Michigan, I was doing other things. The next time we really intersected was when Joe Stiglitz and I were starting the Journal of Economic Perspectives. I mean, we saw each other now and again, but I think both Joe and I were like, oh, we certainly should get Hal involved because he's got so much energy and all these different topics. So he joined the editorial board, brought a lot of ideas in. But one thing I remember, and this will fit, there's a theme here, that there's a number of themes, but this whole Hal and computers and using technology. So we're setting up, it's a new journal, right? So Hal goes, great, it's a new journal. This is 1986. He's a great new journal. He says, you should do e-publishing. This old-fashioned way of publishing is really going out of date. It's going to go away. I'm like, well, we're working with the American Economic Association. They have certain ways of doing things, and so they traditional process. He goes, no, that's you should get ahead of that. Like, well, I don't really know. So work. He says, all right, just as one of these things. There was a certain type of printer he wanted us to get that had like really cool protocols. I don't remember what. This was when laser printers were just coming in. Okay, I don't remember what. It was an Apple printer, right? I don't know. It was some. It's like, and we got. Okay, so I took Hal's advice. Complete disaster. Okay, complete disaster. Because the person we hired then to run the office was like, you needed to like go in and like hand code the printer to do all these things, and it didn't interoperate with the publishers. So thanks Hal, but that one didn't work out so well. Actually, he contributed a lot of other ways. So then if we spin that, so I think when you really see Hal getting into information economics as such, is not coincidentally when the internet's really starting to take off. Okay, so this is, I think, part of what you see with Hal is he's particularly with the technology area, he sees developing technology, and he then, all right, this is since he likes to play in gadgets and everything, so he's playing around with it, like a lot of people do, a lot of engineering types do. But as an economist, then his creative mind starts to work, well, what are all the implications for economics, okay? So this is, I think, what you see with Hal, starting in the early to mid-90s, just this kind of all these topics that he's leading the way because he's seen the internet, and it's sort of all that's associated with that, networking associated with it, digital materials becoming shared, and so he's systematically walking through that. It's part of just thinking about this while I was on the plane from London over the last 12 hours. He has a nice article in Scientific American. It's a very short article. Hal, you remember this? I don't know. It's in 1995, September, The Information Economy. It's just a couple pages, okay? But I read it like, again, very prescient, okay, in terms of what are the elements here that we're going to be looking at, okay? Not predicting which firms or whatever, but just what are the key elements. And one of the things back then was interconnection in internet. How are the pipes going to work? Who's going to pay to move traffic? So there was a whole set of that, which got worked out. And in the theme of that article was a lot of, well, there's a lot of problems we need to solve, and economic problems to get this whole thing to really do what it can do. There's tremendous potential. But then he ends up being an optimist. And we'll, think there's so much potential here, we'll find a way to work it out, including this interconnection was one of them. The concerns about digital material, piracy, online copyright, all that stuff, there, you see that, and he's kind of breaking ground on this, okay? Because he's, a really good economist, seeing the technology really before others, and that's very exciting. And you read this stuff, and it's quite impressive, actually. You go back before other people see these things coming. Talks a lot about standards and the need for standards for things to work together, standards for video, standards for imaging, for images, pricing of digital commodities, renting versus buying versus sharing. So all these things that now, each of these has been developed in so many different ways. So network effects are in there. So this is, we see this developing now. Then he came to Berkeley. I have a little story about him becoming dean of the what was then Sims, now the iSchool. So I had some fairly minor role, I think, in making it happen, but I guess, Hal, maybe you can fill in here. So there was a decision at Berkeley to, basically, the library school had closed down, and they were going to start this new school. Okay. And okay, and so I don't know whether I told you, Hal, about it or you heard about it. So there's a call, like if you're interested, if you want to submit, send a letter and send your CV by a certain date. So Sal sends a letter. Somebody is on the search committee. They're like, well, Hal's sending this thing, but we don't think he's very interested. I'm like, and I talked to Hal. I thought he's really interested. I said, well, why do you think that? Well, he wrote a very short letter. It says, I'm Hal Varian. Here's my CV. Just like just as was requested. That's what they said. That's what he did. They go, well, he didn't really say very much, right? I go, well, you didn't ask for very much. That's the next round, right? So anyhow, it all worked out great. So I have 90 seconds to talk about information rules. So let's just say that was my first book. Hal had written a number. I will just say. Hal was very organized, I've heard, and other things. We had a whole version control system, which I couldn't properly use as far as I remember. And often I'd go to his house. We lived very close by, near each other right then, and we'd go to work on some chapter. But instead, again, Hal would be showing me the dongle or the this and the that, whatever it was. I remember there was like one point, I still remember, it's in the book, I think that's what I remember, and he was like searching for, he said, it's so cool because you can search, and then the advertising and the other things are associated with it, the very early search stuff. You search for like, I don't know why you wanted to go fishing, deep sea fishing or something, and I'm like, okay, and then, so it's in the book, something about deep sea fishing. Anyway, it was a tremendous experience because, in some sense it was highly inefficient because we talk about all these other things and we do all this stuff. I don't know quite how Hal gets so much done when he's also playing around so much. Okay, but we did. Now some people talk about whether we'll have a sequel, and we both have. We talk about it regularly, and I figure, all right, as I've learned from my economics from Hal, I'm going to wait. We're both busy, so I'm waiting until the opportunity cost of his time comes down, so he'll have time for the book, right? I figure, well, he's getting older. The opportunity cost of his time is still really high. Okay, he's so productive and valuable. Maybe now that he's 70, the opportunity cost will finally go down, and we'll be able to do a sequel. So.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ben Hermelin. Since I'm wearing a tie, I'm an academic administrator. It's somewhat interesting that I'm on a panel with Carl Shapiro, because it's through Carl that I first heard of Hal Varian, because Carl taught me intermediate economics when I was an undergraduate. Now, Carl's a wonderful guy, but he had a slightly over-optimistic sense of what Princeton undergraduates could handle. So he signed the first edition of Varian's graduate text as a textbook for the course. Now,
really?
You did. Now, Carl's course made me want to be a microeconomist for many reasons, but among them I was blown away by the elegance of Varian's book. I really appreciate how one could build so many broad theoretical insights from a limited set of fairly general assumptions. Moreover, although plenty of calculus was used, the text revealed that microeconomics wasn't just applied calculus, but relied on a more primitive logic and notions of order. I also appreciated how linkages across not obviously related areas were made. From that book, and admittedly subsequent training and working with some great mentors, some of whom are in the room, and I won't name them, so as they used to say in the old Mission Impossible show, you can disavow any knowledge of my activities. I took to heart that the best papers were those that went outside the mechanics of the mathematics and aimed for an elegance in modeling that helped to make transparent the key economic principles and tried to make connections across literatures whenever possible. As my own career unfolded, a number of Hal's papers proved influential on my own work. So Hal's work on sequential provision of public goods was highly influential for my own work on leadership. His work on non-parametric approaches to production analysis was critical to work I did on savings and loans and the savings and loan crisis. And lastly, much of my own work, especially of late, has involved price discrimination in two-sided markets, especially as it relates to net neutrality and other issues. And I'll talk about that influence in a moment. So not only am I an academic administrator, I'm also the token nerd here. So as many of you know, Hal has done a tremendous amount of important work on price discrimination. So information rules being, of course, one great example because, I mean, it does a lot of things in that book, but among the things it does is it really explains the role of price discrimination in information economics. And it's proved highly influential and remains so. Indeed, I went online just last night and I read the most recent comments on Amazon. Am I allowed to mention Amazon here at Google? Okay. So it's clear that the book remains relevant and useful after nearly 20 years. Within the narrow confines of academia, Hal is well known for developments in the theory and applications of second-degree price discrimination, including auctions. So for those of you who are not economists, a lot of the math behind second-degree price discrimination in auctions is the same math. But among those treasures, I want to focus on one jewel, and that's Hal's 1985 Price Discrimination and Social Welfare. I brought a copy if you want to read it. It's only 5 pages. It's an amazing paper. So whenever I used to teach graduate IO, I would always teach this paper. Why? And why I don't normally teach 30-year-old papers. Because not only does it have a very important result, but because it's so elegant. In my opinion, this is the gold standard of what a theory paper should be. It's a type of paper everyone should aspire to write. Okay, so what's amazing about this paper? Okay, a key result in this paper is the following. Let's assume constant marginal cost of production. Okay, I said I was a nerd. If relative to a regime of uniform pricing, third-degree price discrimination results in no increase in the amount traded, then third-degree price discrimination must be welfare reducing. Now, this is actually a very striking result because we didn't have to analyze how the goods are being allocated across the distinct populations. Moreover, the proof of this is so beautiful, okay? It relies on nothing more than the fact that the demand curve sloped down and the fact that a line tangent to a concave function lies above it everywhere but at the point of tangency. Now, I said that this had an influence on my own work in terms of net neutrality, so let me talk about that because, I mean, most of the other speakers have been good about not plugging themselves, but I'm going to break that. I didn't realize this was a different type of economics conference. You know. In a 2012 paper, Nick Economides and I considered net neutrality, which might be a topic of interest to some of the people here, I don't know. Some have argued, for example, that letting internet service providers charge differential fees for delivering content at differential speeds to the last mile to consumers might increase welfare because consumers might value getting some content, say streaming movies, faster than other contents, for example, the New York Times online, or I suppose I should now say the failing New York Times online. Okay, and in any case, but there are a lot of concerns about this, about the consequence for content providers, the welfare implications of price discrimination through quality distortions are often ambiguous, and so on. So this might seem a daunting problem. It's a daunting problem for someone of my limited intellect. But thinking about Hal's 1985 paper helped point Nick and me towards a strategy of seeing if we could somehow reduce the welfare question to one about the amount traded. And among the results Nick and I established is that if differential speeds don't result in more content being transported, then differential speeds are welfare inferior to uniform speed. Indeed, this is an if and only if result. And the influence of and connection to Hal's 1985 article is clear. As we write of our result, quote, "It is reminiscent of the result that a necessary condition for third-degree price discrimination to increase welfare vis-a-vis uniform pricing is that price discrimination increase the total amount sold vis-a-vis the amount sold under uniform pricing. See, for example, Varian 1985-1989. Our results differ from the results concerning third-degree price discrimination, but nonetheless, I'm out of time. But
she's so nice about it, though.
no, she's not. You have to say that she's nice about it. Okay. In any case, Hal, I mean, your influence on me has been tremendous, and even though I never took a course from you, I have learned so much, and so happy birthday.
All right. right, so I'm the third nerd on the nerdy panel. But I'm not sure. I don't think I can top Ben. So, I want to talk about the fact that not only did Hal help start fields of economics like information economics, but he's accomplished something that is really pretty unique, I think, among academics, in that he's also founded a business discipline, which has become a very important and influential business discipline, but also one that has remained very closely connected to economics and academic research in a way that's sort of continued to have a big influence on the field. And that's sort of this field of tech economics. And he's been a huge inspiration for me personally. Really the experiences that I had following Hal were only made possible by Hal, and it really has changed my life, my career and my life in so many amazing ways. He kind of legitimized the career, paved the way, and really created it. Companies really had hired economists for many years, but they typically did relatively, I would say, non-strategic things like forecasting, macro, exchange rates, and so on, geopolitical issues. And Hal pioneered this role of the chief microeconomist, and also the role of the tech economist. He was really invented this role. Nobody really even understood what it was. And fast forward today, and we have tech economist meetups that have to be capped. I've got top people from companies, and it was eBay, and then it was Amazon calling and saying, can you get me a Hal Varian? And I would have to say, no, I can't get you a Hal Varian. But maybe we can get you something pretty useful. Amazon spent 2 years trying to find their Hal Varian. In that company, now it's grown to they have more than 100 full-time economists and 3 that came from distinguished academic careers there. So many more have these chief economists. I'm on the board of Expedia, and one of my big contributions is in the last 2 weeks we got them a chief economist for one of their brands, and so on. And I'm already getting thank you notes from the CEO about how helpful that's been. Why is this useful? What are the skill sets? What is this thing all about? Well, one thing, just to understand sort of where they win and where they come to them. Most technology firms start with the engineers, and so at some point, and many of them have kind of built a product and attracted consumers before they really worried a lot about making money. And then at some point, they wake up and realize that the way they're going to make money is actually pretty different. Maybe then it might need to be a completely new business model, a new pricing model, and it's not like something that just one person can do. So, Microsoft, in some sense, Bill Gates was their chief economist, and he's a pretty good economist. He's pretty good at everything. When Steve Ballmer took over, if you wanted to think about pricing of Windows, well, you could talk about that with Steve Ballmer, and a small group of people could sort of make those decisions. But when it came to doing something like pricing AdWords, it's really a whole different kettle of fish. It's a new model, and it's not like a price. It's actually a system. It's a set of pricing algorithms that are built in collaboration with engineers. So the fact that Hal was mucking around with computers all this time, made him really the perfect person to get in there and talk to the engineers, engender their respect, be able to get excited about the details and to understand what the technical limitations would be, and not just say, okay, well, here's what theory suggests, but really think about, how is it going to work in practice, and also think about how to measure it, and so on. So, this type of sort of economist, this is an example of economist as engineer, which is something, Paul and Al are here, they've really pushed that in the context of market design, but more broadly in a tech company, the economist as engineer is really huge. And so one thing that makes, why don't business people do the pricing? Well, first of all, it's new, it's hard, it's subtle, it hasn't been done before. You can't call McKinsey and tell them whether you should run a general second price auction. You just can't. But the engineers don't really understand it very well either. And so some of the big things that the economists bring to the table are understanding equilibrium, incentives, information economics, feedback effects, equilibrium effects, and those types of things, which, I found it's surprising how much value economists have to bring to bear. So, you can think about some of the big buckets that Hal and his teams and those of us that followed work on, markets, market design, pricing, price discrimination, incentives, measurement. Just what do you measure? Hal told me a story like at the beginning of AdWords where people were all freaking out about trends, and then he asked them to put the graphs in logs, and it all looked beautiful, and they thought he was brilliant. But economists are, we have a couple of tricks up our sleeves about this. Like we actually understand how to look at numbers in an economically meaningful way, and that can have a lot of value. And then finally also just predicting industry structure and thinking about the welfare implications of what we're doing, which of course helps firms also interact with regulators. So he's had important contributions in all of these areas. So was there in the early days of the AdWords auctions, wrote brilliant economic papers analyzing the AdWords auction, understanding the revenue equivalence theorem between Vickrey auctions and the generalized second price auction, and then also building a structural economic model that he brought to data and was able to use to estimate the welfare effects of that occur on AdWords and see what the profits are that firms are getting through there. And another way that actually Hal and I have spent a lot of time together, sometimes on the same side, sometimes on opposite sides, are all these regulatory issues. Pretty much any time I encountered something, you'd find that Hal was already there and had something important to say about it. Everything from privacy, the implications of big data, intellectual property, and of course competition policy. That's where Hal and I would have to argue with each other, and his sense of humor sometimes got in the way, like when he took one of my slides and took the title off and put hamburger economics on top of it. But it's okay because I was right, so, But even after those testy public debates, we could always have a glass of wine. And he's also been on this parallel journey in terms of the academic leadership that comes out of this. So one of this area now we're calling it economics of digitization, but you can think of information rules as being really like a first pioneering contribution to this field. One of their themes there was, well, technology changes, but the economics doesn't. And of course, it's so nice when you can come in as an economist and there's a multi-billion-dollar decision and something that's really kind of basic economics can be so impactful and surprising and useful. Information rules. I love that book. One of the things, they foresaw a lot of things, not everything. They didn't seem to think how big online advertising would be. And there's also this great story in there about Encarta and how, the price of digital encyclopedias went from $1,600 to $89, and maybe it would even fall, to $30. But we didn't see Wikipedia coming, But it really captured so many things that would be there. And really, being a tech economist, I think, as Carl mentioned, it gives you this chance to see what's coming before it comes and get a chance to kind of get on the bandwagon early. In some of Hal's writing a few years back, he said, four things that were coming as a result of digitization, like data analysis and personalization, customization, personalization, continuous experiments, and new kinds of contracts due to monitoring. And we're already seeing that become a focus of academic research. A lot of my research right now is on these algorithms for personalization, and also like Hal's team at Google did this great work on multi-armed bandits. Instead of standard randomized controlled trials, you can test lots of different things and you start allocating more data to the thing that's doing well. It's something I've been pushing that development economists should start doing, and I point them to the website on Google from Hal's team. Steve Scott has done really nice work and written it up really nicely that many people could use, and they productionize that. And Hal has also made great contributions by trying to help researchers get access to data and create tools that help both companies and researchers do their work. So we've been co-chairing the MBER digitization summer meetings for probably like 8 years now. It's a real successful group, thanks to Jim Paterba, that lets us do that. One of the things that's really fun about it is that it's much more eclectic than a lot of other MBER groups. We have people from information economics, we have people from tech firms, we have people from different groups of business schools. And so I think that also really reflects Hal's leadership, that he has led so many different communities while maintaining these incredibly high standards of scholarship and innovation. So I just really want to thank Hal personally, because you changed my life. You've changed so many people's lives that have followed in your footsteps. And also, you know, I think it's really changed the world. Like, we've built stuff. We've created a lot of impact on the world as economists, as engineers, and that's been really exciting. So thank you, Hal.
Thank you all three for those wonderful speeches. So it's time for dinner. We'll go into the lounge for dinner. We'll be back here at 7:15 for wonderful videos. We're going to have some wonderful images and a couple more panels. And like as I said, we'll have open mic as well at dinner for anybody to come up and say some more words. So.
Sorry to run over.
Oh,
Thank you.
I was so.
Okay, yeah. All right, thank you.
Quick note, happy birthday, Hal. We're so thankful for you. You're just such a great, best boss and best mentor. I'm so inspired by your work, and just so lucky you're quite my boss and mentor. So thank you, happy birthday. We wanted to just give you this is, we will let him share the story of Calvado, and just in case you lose your voice. So keep that in mind for the story when he has a minute to share. Happy birthday, Hal.
So I'm Jeffrey Oldham, and I have the privilege of being one of Hal's graduate students, or on the economics team. And one of the things when you go hang around with Hal is that Hal knows everybody, and he's friends with everybody. So, of course, Hal knows all economists. They've all been his students or his grad students, or he's worked with those professors. And so he brings a lot of the important ones to Google. But sometimes they forget who the important economist is. So Hal once invited former Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, to speak. Right? And so after the talk, Summers, who was still president of Harvard University, there was a line of Harvard alumni that formed, and they were all coming up. And of course, Larry Summers' signature was on the dollar bill at the time, right? So they hand him the dollar bill, and he signed it for the second time, and all the Harvard alumni were really pleased. And so I waited around until the line died down, and then I went up there. And Larry Summers says, "Oh, are you a Harvard alum?" And I said, "No, I'm here to see Hal."
Hal, I want to remind you of something happened I'm Bob Plushko. In 2000, I think my wife, Kat Samuelson, was Hal's first hire at Berkeley. Joint appointment at the law school and his school. That's where I met Hal, because I was the spouse who carried the bags around. A couple of years later, I was at a Silicon Valley company that was located in one market here. And I wasn't very happy. I was kind of tired of all that. And Hal came to visit me because Pam said, "You should talk to Bob, whatever." And we talked about whether I want to come over to Berkeley as an adjunct and maybe talk about e-commerce or something once in a while. Then talking about my company, and he says, "You know, these B2B companies are interesting because they both talk about the frictionless economy and first mover advantages, and they both can't be true." And that Chris, my company, failed a year later. So thank you for letting me come to Berkeley and be an adjunct.
I'm Dan McFadden. I was Hal's thesis advisor at Berkeley, but Hal was also my research assistant. I'd like to tell you a little bit of unknown history, which is that in the projects I was doing at that time, there was a lot of need for high tech. And so I hired a programmer to do my software, some hardware guys to run my Apollo mini computers, and how to update some of my statistical software. The software guy went on to work with Unix, the hardware guys went on to develop the Sun workstation. And Hal got together with a grad student in the computer science department and said, this guy has a really clever conceptual design for compilers, so why don't we rewrite your software using a top-down recursive compiler? And so Hal did, in collaboration with a guy from computer science. That guy went on to become a professor of computer science at Caltech, and my program disappeared, but its language appears now as the S and the R languages. So Hal, and that's another piece of Hal that you probably don't know about. I think he, along with a few others, is one of the people that's responsible for the leading statistical software today.
My name's Jim Paterba, and I met Hal when I was a first-week graduate student in Oxford in 1980. And I, as an undergraduate, like Ben Hermelin, had been exposed to the first edition of microeconomic analysis and had fallen in love with the clean analytical approach that it brought to microeconomics. So when I arrived as a graduate student in a country I didn't know very well, and the first weekend was there figuring out what do you do in Oxford on the weekend when the college is closed, there was this knock on my door, and someone came along and said, "Hi, I'm Hal." I said, "Hal who?" He said, "Hal Varian." And I said, "Well, I'm Santa Claus." But Hal and I, along with a couple of others, Barry Nailbuff and several other North Americans who were in Oxford at the time, would occasionally gather on weekends and over the closest thing we could find to American food, would talk economics, and Hal basically served as an extra thesis advisor for the whole lot of the North Americans who were there. But I wanted to say one thing. You've heard about Hal and jokes, and you've heard about Hal and teaching, but you haven't heard about Hal and jokes in teaching. And I think, I can't verify this, but Hal, while he was in Oxford, taught a course in financial economics. And I am pretty sure that it was the first course in financial economics in Oxford in what was then its about 750-year history. And Hal gave this set of lectures, and the one I particularly remember was around the second or third lecture of the course when Hal was going to talk about arbitrage pricing. And some of you will know the late Steve Ross, who just passed away, had a very influential paper on arbitrage pricing. If you want to do arbitrage pricing the Steve Ross way, you do it as a vector-proof theorem, and you basically talk about prices lying in a particular vector space. But Hal came in and said, today we're going to do arbitrage, and let me tell you a little joke. And I'm going to adapt. I'm not sure I'm going to quite get it all right for the current context, but with apology to my Stanford friends who are here, this is a story, and since I think they're more Berkeley than Stanford here tonight, this is a story about the Stanford professor who's coming home from his house in the Napa Valley, and his car's broken down, so he's waiting at a corner. And this is all Hal's story, told I think about a Cambridge professor at the time. But he's waiting for a bus, and there's a local farmer who comes along. And while they're waiting together, the professor says, it's kind of boring waiting for this bus. Why don't we play a little game? I'll ask you a question, and if you don't know the answer, you can give me $10, and then you can ask me a question. If I don't know the answer, I'll give you $10. So, the farmer's an entrepreneurial kind of guy. He says, sure, I'll take that deal. Then the professor says, wait a minute, that's actually not really fair. I'm a professor at Stanford, and you're just a farmer. So, if I don't know the answer, I'll give you $20. And if you don't know the answer, you give me 10. And I said, fine, okay. And the professor says, why don't you start? So the farmer thinks for a minute and says, okay, can you name an animal that climbs up the hill on 4 legs, comes down the hill on 3 legs, and has 5 red eyes? The professor thinks for a while and says, no, I can't name an animal that goes up the hill on 4 legs, down the hill on 3 legs, and has 5 red eyes. And the farmer says, well, neither can I, but if you give me your $20, I'll give you $10 back. That story has stayed with me for 37 years as the way that you explain arbitrage to somebody who doesn't want to study the vector space proof. Hal, thank you very much.
So I'm Steve Scott. I work with Hal. It's been a great pleasure, and thanks for being a great boss. Hal, I think, probably knows the story that I'm going to tell, and it's a backup for Carl Shapiro's point about how does he get so much work done when he, has so much fun kind of messing around. So at Google, there's a lot of fun events, right? And so shortly after I joined Google, there was a fun event. It was a trivia competition. And there was a woman on our team that put a team together that was just going to ace this thing, right? So she asked me to be on the team because I have this encyclopedic knowledge of like 1980s and 90s trivia. There's a younger person on the team who knew all the stuff that happened after I had kids. And then Hal was there to get all the stuff about, Shakespeare and poetry and things like that, right? Well, so this question comes up, and it's a question about Beyonce Knowles, right? And you guys are a sexy crowd, so I'm sure you all know who Beyonce Knowles is. She's sort of the queen of pop music, right? Beyonce. And I forget exactly what the question was, but it was something like, when is Beyonce Knowles' birthday? Or what did Beyonce do for her birthday party or something like that? And all of us were looking around at each other, and the only person that knew the answer was Hal. And we're slack-jawed, right? The three of us are like, Hal had apparently read the internet that day or something. But to kind of get the look off of our faces, he looks at us and goes, what, you didn't realize I've got a master's degree in Beyonce?
So the next panel is UC Berkeley SIMS, School of Information Management Systems, which is now called the iSchool, but when Hal was there, it was called SIMS. So we have a panel of 3 speakers. The first is Pam Samuelson.
So like many of you, I met Hal before the part of my life and his life that I'm about to relate. And I want to say something about it because I met Hal first through the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference, TPRC, and actually I know Joe Farrell and I knew Suzanne Scotchmere and maybe a couple of others of you through TPRC. It was nobody's favorite conference. But it was a conference where people who were like trying to think ahead about what was telecommunications going to happen. And the internet became part of the conversation at TPRC, and Hal and I were both interested in what is the internet going to do to our ability to communicate with each other. And it was really important that people weren't just looking at this issue through a silo. You were thinking about it in a broad way. You were talking to people who had different kinds of expertise, and you were really trying to cast yourself forward in a way that's actually hard for most of us to do, but it's easier to do when you're able to talk to other people who are also trying to think forward. So one of the things that I valued so much about that conference was that I had a chance to meet people like Hal and to go to the sessions that he was talking about, kind of information economics, which I was not really familiar with actually at the time that I started going to TPRC. I was trying to teach broadcast regulation and telecommunications regulation, and I didn't know anything about the economics, so it was really important to go to a conference like this and actually be able to ingest the economic concepts so that I could be a better person in my field. And Hal was one of the most important people, partly because he actually spoke English. Not every economist who participated in TPRC was good at the English thing. There was so much economic jargon, and Hal actually, I think one of the things that I have valued about him over the years is non-jargonistic person who actually is able to like connect to people and appreciate that people like me might have something to bring to bear who wasn't trained as an economist. So that's kind of like, how did I get to know Hal? It was through TPRC. But the thing that actually I think about when I think about Hal is I think about an academic entrepreneur. There are very few opportunities in life for an academic person to be an entrepreneur. And a lot of academics wouldn't want to be, okay? And actually the thing that I think drew Hal to Berkeley was the opportunity to be an academic entrepreneur because the program that the information school, as it's called now, was and was envisioned to be, was something completely different than any other school that had ever been established. So the information school, the School of Information Management and Systems, we had to change the name because not even the chancellor could remember what it stood for. Okay. But that school was a brand new school. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. And it was actually born out of the ashes of the library school, which was a big library school, but very traditional. And Berkeley basically said, you know, we're looking forward to the future, and libraries are an important thing, but they need to be thought, and the idea of organizing information, enabling access to information, needs to be thought through in a completely different way. So the idea of helping frame what a new school, which was more focused on what are the opportunities, what are the benefits, what are the costs, what are the what are the ways in which essentially the economy could be transformed through information technology, was something that I think deeply interested Hal, but also not very many people knew how to think about it. And so he was the absolutely ideal person to come and be the founding dean of this new school. He had been thinking about computing technologies, networks, and about economics of information, and very few other people had been able to do that. But also for Berkeley, it was important to say, we don't want this just to be like a little variation on library schools. We want to create something completely different. We want to actually create a program that will be for information technology professionals, kind of like a public policy school is for people who want to go into public policy as a politician or as a bureaucrat or other kinds of things, where you need to know a little bit about this, 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 a little bit about this. So what do you need to know to be a first-class information technology professional? You need to know a little bit about information organization and retrieval. You need to know something about user interface design. You need to understand user interactivity patterns. You need to know about networks. You need to know about economics of networks. You need to know about security. You need to know law and policy. You need to know something about social sciences and the social implications of technology and project management. one of the things that was so amazing and wonderful about the sim school that Hal founded was that the master's students didn't do master's theses, they did master's projects, right? You want to actually make people able to do things in the world, and you want them to be able to use the projects that were their capstone as something that would allow them to integrate all of the things that they had learned in all of the classes in order to be able to make something new and different and be able to then collaborate with other people. So Hal basically taught us all how to collaborate, and the students had to make presentations about their projects. They had to build things and they had to try to make them work. And our students have gone on to all kinds of wonderful positions at Google and Salesforce and many other technology companies. But it's also the case that he was able to bring many of us who had different kinds of expertise. Marty Hurst, brilliant user interface designer, and me, law policy person, and John Chuang, economics of networks person, Doug Tigar, a cryptography expert, and Peter Lyman, who unfortunately isn't with us anymore, but a person who was really interested in kind of what is an information society and how does information technology really help us understand things. So I will say that Hal did an amazing job building this program while at the same time being a first-class intellectual and scholar, and actually inducing all of us on the faculty to say, we have to be really creative and really productive because Hal is he's running the school, he's designing the curriculum, he's doing all these things to make the school a success. So we should just try to actually make him proud. So we have tried to do that, Hal, and so thank you. You've changed my life, you've changed the lives of so many of the people on the faculty. You've changed my husband's life because he has actually for the last 14 years taught at the information school. Yay. Something to do after he finished this other stuff that he did. And you've changed the lives of the students. So bravo to you and thank you and bless you and happy birthday.
Next is Frederick Wallenberg.
And this is on, yes. So I was probably the first choice after the other 20 choices had said no to represent some of the students that went to the School of Information back when Hal was a dean. I also realized that this would probably not be a good opportunity for me to try to show off my talents as an economist, given this illustrious guest list. So I'm going to take a different tack. So I decided to do my PhD at SIMS almost entirely because Hal was there. Sure, the Bay Area is moderately pleasant, even though it lacks the long and cozy dark nights of Stockholm. The summers of Houston that made me forget that I missed my saunas. The air here is way too crisp when you're used to the comforting, enveloping smog of Santiago. As you can tell, it was quite an uphill battle for Hal when he was trying to recruit me. He unknowingly started working on me almost 10 years earlier while I was taking microeconomics at Stockholm School of Economics. There, at the great pressure of lugging around some 5 pounds worth of Hal's intermediate microeconomics. I'm not sure it was due to this light bedtime reading or disdain for marketing, but I ended up an econ major. But I had to go back and check, see if it actually was as great to read as I thought it was. So I went to Amazon here the other day and looked at some of the comments, and this is what I found. I found myself pleasantly surprised by its readability. Not only is this book a really good source of economic knowledge, but the author has a wonderful sense of humor. Excellent. Ordered for college and reach much better than most economics textbooks. That's where someone would add a little, yeah, and. But what it shows, and what we've already heard tonight, is that Hal has always been a great communicator. He has the ability to make something difficult, some difficult concepts, relatively simple and clear. He can take something that, for most people, would take long equations and translate it into English, words that even I can understand. And I think, from that perspective, a lot of students that and non-students that really have a lot to thank for. So here I am 10 years later after my intermediate microeconomics, and I was trying to figure out where to go to school. And a colleague at the time suggested I go on Amazon and buy Information Rules, which where did that go? Oh, which I have right here. And thank you, Carl, wherever you are. But I'm going to focus on Hal. So I had an interview with Hal over the phone, and so I spent the 2 days before that interview reading through this book and being mesmerized by it. So take that, Tom Clancy and Dan Brown. Well, with a chance to study with a rock star like Hal, I mean, how could I go anywhere else? So for the longest time, I had this copy of Information Rules sitting on my bookshelf, just waiting for me to gather up the courage and get a signature in it. But there's something about the power balance between professors and students that just didn't make me feel comfortable doing that. So I brought it here today, and I'm not going to leave before you and Carl have signed it.
And you're making me regret I didn't bring my copy.
This is all very nice, but I'm sure everyone's sitting there waiting, where's the dirt? I mean, where are the juicy parts? I polled all of Hal's PhD students that he had at Berkeley, and neither of us could come up with anything. Maybe there is no dirt, or just maybe he's using his position with Big Brother to blackmail his accusers and bury the search results. Whatever is the case, we've decided that Hal's next move should be to run for president. He's obviously figured out how to manage the media. He displays presidential communication habits. I mean, show of hands, how many of you have received emails for Hal at 4 in the morning? Now, all we have to do is get him to switch to Twitter. May I suggest real Hal Varian? Now, forget Hal 9000. This is all about Hal 2020. Happy birthday.
Okay, so the computer scientists all have slides.
What can they make them work?
We also know to be patient. Alright. So, Hal Varian hired me at UC Berkeley, but I also knew him before because I've been in the digital library space, and just everybody knows Hal because Hal knows everybody. So Hal came to UC Berkeley. This is beautiful UC Berkeley. Is my mic not on? It's not loud enough. Is this better? Yeah. Hal came to UC Berkeley. This is beautiful UC Berkeley at sunset. But you know, when you hang out with Hal, that's not really the part of Berkeley you see. So for example, Hal and I would go to lunch a lot of the time.
So Hal the Gourmand, here's where you would go. So this was La Cheval. It's changed names. Sorry, Hal. So he would always want to go to places like this. So of course I would get indigestion at a place like this. But if you went to lunch with Hal, you would always spend $5 or less. So there was this place. There was like the pita place. But you know, he was, as people have said, Hal was the adventurer, the early adopter. So I would always have my first whatever with Hal, like the first boba tea. I never heard of boba tea, but I had boba tea for the very first time at this place with Hal. He was always adventurous in trying things that you'd never heard of before. So when Hal was the dean, so I have Hal the Berkeley Dean, the economist. So here was Hal in the office at UC Berkeley. Now you might remember this drama behind getting those bookshelves and that desk and so on. It was basically he committed like a crime, a state of California crime, by ordering the furniture, which he wasn't allowed to do. You can see the tech poster in the background. People have already talked about Hal doing tech, and he has a lovely computer monitor on his desk. So I would often come by Hal's office just to hang out and say hi, and as people said, he would say, "Hey, I got this cool demo for you," and yes, hours would then go by. So this is how Berkeley did not look like this when he was at Berkeley. It was not that imposing. Yes, this was another picture of South Hall. This was the building that we worked in. It was a beautiful quilt done by Carol that hung in Hal's office. So we saw that all the time when we went to his office. So the amazing thing was Hal was dean at this new school. He was always giving interviews, always talking to people. But then he also managed to do just kick-ass research somehow. So something he did while he was there, along with Peter Lyman, was the very famous How Much Information study, where they figured out how much information was being used digitally in the world. And they did it in, I think, first 1999 is what it says, and then they redid it in 2003. And this got quoted all over the place by figuring out how much information there was in the world. Did not thank me, although it was actually my idea. All right. It was a very important study. They also did a study of how people use internet bandwidth, and all the professors and everybody were guinea pigs in this study, and they figured out the way pricing was going to work for internet for the future, and they were completely right, and they did it with this real study with people really using internet bandwidth, and it was basically, you could control if you were getting, how much you were paying for every megabyte or kilobyte or whatever it was in those days, and you would turn it on or off like a little gerbil and control how much you were paying, and people were very price sensitive. I know I was. People have said, Hal was an early adopter, so he would always know about the cool thing before everyone else. So Hal was the first person I heard about Iron Chef. So I was going to do a trivia thing here, but I didn't get enough trivia questions. But my trivia question, one of them was going to be, what's Hal's favorite cooking show? And the answer was going to be Iron Chef. But I didn't know if it was still true or not. And I remember him also talking about replay TV when it first came out, before anyone else was using it. And Hal and I would always have these arguments about things. Like I would say, I don't want people spying on me. And he's like, oh, but it's really cool. And we're still saying that. Every time he tells me about something cool Google's doing, I'm like, I don't want it spying on me. And he's like, oh, it's really cool. Oh, it's your home. And we're still having that conversation. and I keep being that way, and it keeps more and more stuff spying. And as many people have said, Hal's the hacker. And for all you economists, that's really cool. He's like the hacker. But I'm the computer scientist, so this is extremely embarrassing. And Hal is much more of a hacker than I am. That's actually embarrassing. So people have talked about, I don't know if Tim's here or not, but we have some O'Reilly books. Oh, he's here. All right, there you go. So I got some O'Reilly books, the famous animal books. So he didn't have the books. He probably could have written the O'Reilly books. But so Hal would hack tech, as people said. He'd be hacking Linux. He actually hacked PostScript. I mean, this is just insane. I mean, I would only write in LaTeX, which is like the baby version of writing a paper in tech. So it's just really impressive, and no one knows where he gets the time for this sort of thing. And then, of course, Hal the punster. Hal loves puns. Hal loves jokes. Hal loves to be silly. And so, he just really likes to look funny. And finally, there's Hal the friend. And Hal's a great friend. You think everyone who knows him feels that he's their friend. And I feel very, very fortunate to have had Hal be my friend for these many years, be both a faculty member and a friend. And so, happy birthday, Hal, and thanks for being so much of a friend. now the moderator again, and I'm going to bring up the Google panel, and I'm going to keep my computer up because we have visuals. So, Google panel, please come up. We have Doug Beaverman, Fabian Kurtamillet, Peggy Chu, and Tony Fagan. Sorry, I don't know how to say people's names. And I don't know if you're going to want to control your visuals or not. And you are?
Doug.
Doug. Doug, I don't recognize you. It's good to see you again. All right. So I will just let you.
I do this. I'm a nervous public speaker, except when I'm reciting poetry. So I joined Google in 2004, left in 2011, and Hal was there for all of that time. Early in my Google career, in 04, 05, I was with Hal in what was called the ISDesigns team, which is kind of like, I guess today would be called like the data science team for AdWords. And then later in my Google career, joined the econ team. But I'm going to be talking about the ISDesigns team here because I think we have some really good representation from the econ team. So 2004 was a magical time at Google. All of engineering was stuffed into one building called Building 42, and the ISDesigns team was in this corner of the second floor, right next to the CEO, Eric Schmidt, and you know, celebrities would walk past on their way to see Eric Schmidt and on the way to see other executives, and lots of products were being released, and it was just there was just always a hive of activity, and it was a very fun time. And Hal, as a consultant to the ISDesigns team, would help out with virtually every project. And from my perspective, I was in a cube right outside of that magical corner office with my colleague Galina, who is not here. She's in Sweden now, otherwise I would have VC'd her in. And we, one aspect of Hal's interaction with us is that he would sidle up next to us, find out what we were working on, and then suddenly, like 1, 2, 3 days later, maybe would appear in our inbox at some unpredictable hour of the day, an email that answered, you know, whatever quandary we were in, usually with very extensive documentation and Mathematica notebooks at the time. And Galina, at some point in March or April of that year, she's like, we should call these halograms. And another aspect of Hal's interaction with us was that, as we've already learned, he was very gifted with wordplay, and in fact, he would frequently write little poems and jokes and puns, and they would be incorporated either into the content of the halograms or into his daily interactions with us. And so I wanted to find some of those poems that he wrote, but of course I actually no longer work at Google, and they have very strict policies against allowing ex-employees to access email. So I couldn't find them, but I thought that in retaliation for those puns I would write my own my own poem all about the halograms that we received. And it's in a waltz meter, so if you want to dance, you can. All right, sorry, I have to sort of get into it. It's like a spoken word poem, so I have to get into the vibe here. Picture it, B42, second floor, midwinter gloom of 2004. Before data science was bandied about, back when big data was barely a sprout. ISDesigns at Google did all of these things, and we credit a mentor who gave us our wings. Dreesen, Pateltang, Shubina, and Stoll got a critical boost from this generous soul. There in the flash cube, that room with a view, the colorful corner of B42, we gawked as celebrities walked past our door. I'm sure I saw Bono and maybe Queen Noor. I think we did actually see Queen. But visits from him are the ones we're indebted for, steeped in analyses, stories, and metaphor. His stature,
attire, and the depth of his vocals all made him a curious fit with the locals. But Dreesen Patel Stol Shabina et al. Thrived with a force multiplier called Hal. In moments of doubt or blind indecision, Hal answered our need for adult supervision. Hal understood then, with all of his talents, that AdWords success needs a delicate balance of customers, users, and publishers' wisdom, while pushing and pulling the parts of a system in Nash equilibrium, framed by some theories of ad clicks, impressions, conversions, and queries, and click rates, and network effects, and the notion of second price auctions and top ad promotion. Hal's rigorous emails routinely enthralled. Halograms are what they came to be called. Halograms made us feel over the moon at 6 a.m., 10 p.m., midnight, or noon. Round-the-clock Varian, valiant and valorous, packaged with notebooks and careful analysis. Halograms vanquish the most enigmatic of problems by forces of pure mathematica. His research reviews would, with grace and simplicity, crystallize concepts. Crystallize concepts like heteroscedasticity. Every regression, each model, each scatter plot lifted our spirits, and goodness, we had a lot. Diane, Sean, Mariana, Tom, Vic, Fox, and more, now armed with holography, settled the score. Here's something Hal Varian said to Xing Wu. Like everything else in this poem, it's true. At 20, I wish I was 40, Hal quoted. But by 40, I wished I was 20, he noted. So what does he want to be now that he's 70? Now he's got everything, even longevity. Sexiest job in the world? Statistician. So goes his famously droll premonition. It's mostly correct. By the way, it is, yeah, so correct. Because Hal made the prediction somewhere around 05, 06. So look what's happened since. It's mostly correct, but there's clearly some woodeness. Surely there's no sexier role than economist. Smart pricing, chief auctioneer predicting the present and future this year.
Yeah, computer scientists put the economists to shame.
Follow that guy.
That represents to get the reps for
Read the last two.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Fabien. I've got the good fortune of being on Hal's economics team, and it's really a privilege to be able to reminisce on some of some events from his Google years. But let me start by taking things right back down to the beginning, at least for most economists. When do you meet Hal? And see if I can smooth. There you are. And it is, of course, with one of his world-famous economics textbooks, and they're the workhorse of education at university departments around the world, and certainly how I met him. And depending on which specific book and which specific edition, you might visualize Hal in various ways. Some of those, depending on the fashion of the time. And so, you can truly say that Hal is an adoptive father for basically, all economists. But maybe really we should call him the Godfather, and in fact he has been officially dubbed the Godfather by the New York Times, so you know that it's true news these days. So he is indeed the Godfather of tech economists, and you see him pictured here in another comic in The Economist, actually, with Susan Preston and Steve. Well, let's move on to his Google years. You heard from Jonathan earlier about how he was asked to come visit his cute little startup called Google back in 2002. He clearly charmed everyone's socks off, and they asked him to come consult for them. And Eric Schmidt told him, well, we'd like you to have a look at this little ad auction we're tinkering with. We think it might make us a little money. So, obviously understatement of a century. I looked at it, figured it out, published about it, and made it even better. And it's no surprise that Hal was asked to take a look at the auction because at his core, he's a microeconomist and he works very, very hard to put the micro in microeconomics every day on campus. You see him here demonstrating. I would say, so despite the microeconomics chops, one thing that's remarkable about Hal is, for those of you who are not economists, there's roughly 3 branches of service, right? There's micro, macro, and econometrics. And you generally join one branch and you spend the rest of your life sniggering about people in the other branches. But Hal actually, started from micro and then became a master in all 3 branches, so he can really do everything. And that's a little bit why, he's assembled, this is the economics team, he's assembled a mixed martial arts team to help him with stuff. We're all very varied people, and I know what you're all thinking. I mean, we must have been, selected here on sheer good looks, but I hear the selection criteria was different. Thank you. But anyways, some of the stuff Hal does here at Google illustrates this diversity. I mean, it's anything, right? Auction theory and design we've mentioned, macroeconomics, so he opines on exchange rates and stuff. He thinks deeply about economic measurement in the economy and how things change in the digital age. Free goods everywhere, how are we counting GDP, how are we measuring or mismeasuring productivity? What do our trade statistics mean when you ship Android operating systems to China as email attachments? He helps central bankers stick thermometers in the economy more precisely, measure stuff up in real time. Econometrics and machine learning, and in policy he's thinking about driverless cars and the value thereof, the future of work when automation comes around, regulatory economics, you name it, Hal is on it. So he has a really varied diet, highly incomplete list. But to think about his impact at Google, you really have to ask the engineers, because at the end of the day, heart and soul of Google is our engineering people, and he's made a deep impression here too. And engineers are interesting people, and one of the ways in which they communicate is via memes. They have this language, so they actually have written memes about Hal over the years, and here's a few of them. So first of all is the impression Hal makes when he shows up on an email thread. And it's absolutely real. It's awesome stuff. But unfortunately, you quickly realize that there's maybe some unwelcome stuff, because there's something called the curse of Hal, which is, imagine you have a brilliant idea. The odds are that Hal already thought about it. In fact, not only thought about it, but published about it 5 years ago. So this is a sort of mission accomplished team. The other element of Google you may or may not know about is that it's populated by a lot of alpha individuals, and alpha individuals may sort of do unwise things. One of those things is arguing economics with Hal Varian, and it doesn't always turn out that well for people who are engaged in that sort of thing. So, anyways, you can see that he's had a deep impact left, right, and center. He's taken, he takes us on unexpected places, and not only substantively. So, for his team, he takes us on offsites, and here is a few pictures of Hal the adventurer in an offsite, doing zip linings in the redwoods near Santa Cruz. Some years back, and he's not afraid of heights, as you can tell, and it was really pretty steep. But there's another interesting moment, and I don't know here if the technology will fail us. This was in beautiful Google Slides, whereas it was important to Microsoft. But this was a video. You can actually find it on YouTube. If you type "Flying Hal," it's on the public YouTube. This was an indoor skydiving session. And fortunately, we do see Hal mid-flight here. It's absolutely beautiful, mastery, control, for a brand new discipline. Again, totally nailed it, and it was quite a fun offsite. But just looking back, one big thing that really stands up for me is Hal the educator, because I suppose you can take the man out of university, but maybe not the university out of the man. And following him around over the years, of course, you get to pick up a lot of economics, but also a lot of wisdom about life in general. I can say that Hal is exceptional. I mean, he's not only a planetary class genius, as we all know, but he's also a really first-class human being in every respect. And what I'd like to propose to this audience is that we all sort of get together behind a huge effort to basically put Hal and we even have a mock-up for it already. So thank you so much, Hal.
Don't expect too much from the next two. That's my boss right there. It's all good.
Who's your boss?
Hi, I'm Penny Chu. I've worked with and for Hal for the last 10 years. He's been a great mentor. So I wanted to. I'm sure I won't be very articulate, but I wanted to share some of my fondest memories and stories of me knowing Hal for the last 10 years. So I actually came to Google 10 years ago, and I actually worked on the Google IPO at Credit Suisse when I was a banker there. And when I joined through the acquisition, my manager at the time said, "You worked on the IPO, you must know Hal Varian." And I'm like, did not know him. But we met with the Google IPO team every week for 6 to 9 months. So I was like, how did I not know Hal Varian? And my manager at the time said, like, no, Hal was the main guy behind all the auction stuff. And so when I first met Hal, of course I actually, went up to him. I was like, oh, I heard you worked on the IPO. How is it possible that I've never met you, even though I was on the banking team? And then I found out that Google secretly had kept Hal in the background away from all the bankers so that whatever the bankers were proposing in terms of the auction proposal, Hal would fact check everything and make sure that the bankers that were proposing the right things for the Google IPO. So that was how I got to know Hal in the first place. So the next cool thing I remember when I first met Hal was the fact that he was the main guy behind the microeconomics book that I read in college. And I remember when I first heard about this, the first thing I did was pick up the phone and call my sister saying, "Do you have your economics book? I want to get Hal to sign the copy." And then my sister said, I didn't do very well in that class. So maybe, don't tell Hal, but maybe he shouldn't sign my book. So I was like, okay. So this is a personal anecdote, and I think Hal and I joke about this all the time. So I don't usually wear glasses to work, and by then I had worked for Hal for a few years. And one day I think I got some allergies in my eye, and I wore glasses to work, and Hal comes by my cube and said, you look smarter today with your glasses on. And in typical quant analyst fashion, I'm like, Hal, what was the baseline prior to this comment? Was it a little bit smart, or was it pretty smart already before the incremental smartness? If the baseline was pretty high, I will gladly take any of the incremental smartness with the glasses on. The other cool thing of knowing Hal, for those of you who don't know, is Hal has been living at the Google house during the weekdays when he's working on campus. And so, the first time we actually got to visit the Google house, this is the house that Google was founded in, was because Hal lived there, and his team at the time decided to throw a party. So all of us got to visit the Google house, and we checked out the garage that Google was supposedly founded in. This was back in 2009, and the one funny story I would tell you is we actually all typed in the address to the Google house, and Google Maps actually mapped us to the wrong place. I mean, many of us was going to that Google house, and we're like, that is not the Google house. I mean, it was like 2 or 3 blocks away, and we're like, wow, we actually have to follow a bug to tell Google Maps to actually map Google house to the right place. The other story I wanted to share with you is there are a lot of VPs at Google now, but I would say that amongst many of the VPs, Hal is, and I'm sorry for all the other VPs and SVPs here, but I think based on my experience, Hal is one of the VPs where, if you want to have a meeting with Hal, just add it to his calendar. I think one coworker one time asked me, and he knew I knew Hal, and he was like, I would love to get Hal's advice on something. He was like, Penny, what's your advice in terms of how to get in touch with Hal, or how can I set up a meeting? Can you help me get through to Hal? I'm like, no, just add it to his calendar. He was like, what do you mean? I'm like, no. His calendar is open. Whatever the free slots are, just tell him, I would like your advice on something, just add it to his calendar and go ahead. And sure enough, I told Hal, and Hal was like, yeah, just have him put a meeting on my calendar and I'll meet with him. So thank you, Hal. You've been very, very accessible to all of us. I think all the economists here would appreciate this story. So as you know, Hal is quite the foodie, and so am I. And every so often, we would decide not to eat Google food. And on Mondays in Menlo Park, there are these food trucks parked outside some supermarket in Menlo Park. And so Hal would oftentimes suggest, oh, maybe we can go to the food trucks. And of course, I'm having dinner with our chief economist, and what am I going to take advantage of? Which is to ask him, what should I do with my money? And so this is my opportunity to get great advice from someone who's clearly very, very smart, and I get great advice from over the years. The final story I would share with you, and I think I see Kent here, is over the years, my manager works in Boulder, but Hal is my local mentor / manager, and once or twice over the last 10 years, I've gotten pings from the lawyer saying, you have a litigation hold in your inbox. And I'm freaking out thinking oh my gosh, the world is crashing, I'm gonna get sued, Google's gonna get sued, what are we gonna do? And so I really appreciate the accessibility that Hal has, where one time I remember walking into his room saying, Hal, do you have a minute? And he was like, sure, of course, I'm happy to talk to you. I close the door, and the first thing I say, Hal, I think we're gonna get sued, what are we gonna do? And so I tell him the story. And I think what I appreciate the most is, as you all know, Hal has experienced so much over his life, and he's got great advice, and I just really, really appreciate you calming me down, saying you know what, Penny, everything will be just fine, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it. So anyhow, I just want to say thank you for being a great mentor, friend, and colleague over the years. Happy birthday.
Where the trouble starts. Okay, so it's working. I have to excuse the cold. Attach it. Okay. No, that'll work. It's okay. All right. So my career at Google was largely made by telling people I know Hal. And I'm not joking, really. I'd go to meetings, I'd say something, I'd be the only person in the room saying it, everyone else would look at me like I'm crazy, and I'd be like, did I mention I work for Hal? And then everyone would be like, okay, we'll do. So I thought I'd retrace the steps a bit. So when I first got to Google, my first question, and I asked a shocking number of people how the ad auction worked, and they didn't know. And finally somebody told me, go talk to Hal. And I said, Hal who? And they said, Hal Varian. And I thought that was some kind of joke for go read a book. Figure it out yourself. If you have to ask, you're too stupid and you wouldn't understand. And then after the second or third person said, Hal, I realized, so the second time it happened, I remember thinking, the micro guy? What? And just dismissing it. And then the third time I realized, okay, he probably works here. And I looked him up, and then I found his page, and then I started reading more and more about auctions, and I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. And I stopped after, it got really painful after the 300th page of math. Okay, that was the beginning, but I still hadn't met Hal yet. And then, this may also be surprising, but one day I found myself without a manager. And then I learned that I will be reporting to Hal, and he was going to be my manager. And so that kind of freaked me out. And I realized, I was going to meet him for the first time the next day, and I realized I hadn't read his micro book. So I stayed up most of the night reading the micro book. And I show up the next day, and I go to his office, and I introduce myself. I start telling him a little about what we do, and then we're just silent, and we're just staring at each other. And then I realized he doesn't know he's going to be my manager. And I go, you're my new manager. And he thought I was kidding. And so I said, then he looks at me and he goes, and I was like, I'm really not kidding. And then after a while, he laughs and goes, okay, well, what do you do? And I go, I will do what you want me to do. And I'm like, at this point, I'm thinking this is an interview. If he says no, then they're going to get rid of me. And it's just hilarious. And so then I finally said, well, I've got to, I studied statistics. He goes, oh, okay, you can stay. And then the second meeting with him, I realized I forgot to tell him I had a team. And then I go, oh, there's also a team, but it's a relatively small team. And then he goes, okay, well, you're going to have to manage them all. I go, okay, that's cool. And then he started describing, I started asking him about managing teams, and he started saying, and I met the rest of his team. And I realized that his advice to me, which was really great, was just hire really uniquely talented people. There's a lot of smart people in the world, but hire people that can do things that no one else around you can do. And so that's basically been my tenet for building a team at Google. And it's worked very well. Okay. Like the third meeting with him was, he finally actually asked me if I needed anything. And I said, well, I could kind of use a place to live. Totally serious. And I was like, well, I've got a place you can live. And again, I thought we were still joking and all these things. And weeks goes by and he says, well, are you going to come over? And I go, really? Like your house? And this is the Google house. And I assume the quilt. It's a family quilt. Carol, of course. Okay. And I've been staying with him when I'm in town ever since. So I've learned a lot of late nights with Hal in his bathrobe. I was going to put a picture of that up, but decided not to. You'll just have to imagine it. But then I was talking late into the night about various things going on across Google or the world. And so I've got my education late at night over many, many years. And another thing I've learned from Hal is you can never know enough statistics. And this is particularly true for even if you've studied statistics, and I thought I actually knew something about it, and it turned out I would run into all sorts of problems at Google and not know how to solve them. And I'd go to Hal, and I'd say, how do I deal with this? And one in particular was the sales team came to us, and one of the things Hal told me early on was never let the sales team find you. So at that point, I thought I might actually be getting in trouble with my manager here. And when the sales team found me, they wanted to know sort of what the benefit was of all these services that they were offering advertisers, and what the benefit to the advertiser was, and you could look at their accounts, and the Google revenue, what the benefit, the incremental revenue to Google was. And so I thought about this problem, and I came to Hal, of course, and he says, oh, you need propensity scores. And this is an area of statistics called causal modeling that I didn't know much about. So there I was again, feeling like I knew nothing about statistics and needed to go back to school. And we did this project, we did causal modeling, and then we went in and we presented it to Eric Schmidt and Larry and Sergey and everyone else. And the sales team was all excited because they could quantify the value they were delivering to Google and all this, and so then they were like, well, you better come in case somebody asks a question. And so I was at the meeting, and normally I wouldn't be there, and Eric Schmidt asked me, he goes, what's propensity scores? Because we talked about it, and he asked him how it worked, and so he explained it, and then he said, what's a propensity score? And so I explained it, and then there's this awkward silence in the room, and here I'm also wondering if I'm going to lose my job at that point again. And then I said, well, you know, I work for Hal. And everyone's like, oh, okay, this is great. And then the funniest part of this meeting was I get this frantic email from this product manager sort of like at 11 o'clock that night and said, you really need to help me with propensity scores. And I said, how does everyone but me know about propensity scores across Google? Is there some class they taught? It's like for Googlers that I wasn't aware of. And so then this product manager explains to me that they were going in after us, and it was the Google Analytics team. And this was like maybe a year after we had bought Google Analytics, and they were explaining how much money they were making for Google through this product. And apparently Eric Schmidt said to him, do you know what a propensity score is? And they were all silent, looking at each other. And you have like senior engineers and all this sort of, it's just, you know, and then he said, well, I think you all need to leave and come back when you do. And then they spent the rest of the day tracking down the phrase to me, and then finally found me at 11 o'clock at night. It was like, we need to see you now. Okay, I've got to speed this up. Okay, my next big problem I ran into was actually trying to understand a problem that had no data. And sure enough, after telling many, many people we couldn't do it, I go to Hal and I mention it to Hal and he goes, oh, this is no problem. When you don't have data, you just simulate it. And he explains how he built this bid simulator, and so now, interestingly enough, there's a whole project in ads called Airborne, which is sort of redefining how we measure ads, and the entire thing is based on simulation. So if it doesn't work, it's Hal's fault. Okay, and then one of the other things I learned was to give back to the community, and Hal has been very generous with the whole company, and our team has followed suit, and we've always contributed to whether it's statistical computing or out there in the external world or to other groups, and to always be available to answer their questions. And that part of the culture really came from Hal. And then finally, the last slide, promise, is of course you have to learn to tell a joke. And my favorite Hal joke is when I walk by Hal in the hallway and he's got makeup on and I'm like, yeah. And he just had gotten done with this big story with the Times, and they were asking all these questions about information, how much information Google had, and about the world and all these kinds of things. And then the last question the reporter asked him was, you know, okay, I just have to ask you, how close are you to perfect information? And Hal's answer, and I'm sure you remember this, was 25 feet. And there's this awkward pause. And then he finishes the punchline with, I said 25 feet from Eric Schmidt, the CEO.
Well, that's a perfect segue to this.
Look at this shirt. Red is the color of socialism. Hal is not a socialist. He's really a physics major. When he came here, what he did is he figured out that if you just looked at the physics of clicks, you could make $1 billion business. Thank you, Hal, and happy birthday.
Eric was here just a little bit earlier in time. So, right, to conclude this part of the program, we have a video montage. A photo montage. And then we will go for cake and house.
give Republicans this. But I just need to know, before I can go, what the heck rhymes with Stiglitz? So finally I got over the writer's block. He said, yeah, it's pretty tough, that challenge. So I came up with number 2. There once was a guy named Joe. A man, always on the go. As the students attest, he's the best of the best at teaching us what we should know. Well, thank you, Joe.
Gather around to hear a few words from Hal. I want to first thank the Google people, even though I don't think any of them are still here, but most of this was brought to us by Eric Schmidt and the Google executive team, so let's give them a round of applause to thank them for that. Okay, so now we're going to hear hopefully some wit and wisdom, or at least some bad puns, from our esteemed guest, Hal Varian.
Well, I have to say you guys are a tough act to follow, that's for sure. But I do want to tell one little story. I'd like to take you back in time, 2,000 years ago. They're feeding Christians to the lions. So they put out the first Christian. They release the lion. He rushes at the Christian and he jumps aside just before he gets there and whispers in his ear. The lion trots over to the side of the amphitheater and sits there quietly. They bring out the next lion. The lion rushes for the Christian. He jumps to the side, whispers in the ear. The lion goes over and sits quietly at the side of the stadium. This goes on for 3 or 4 more lions. Finally, the emperor looks down. He says, "We're out of lions. I have to let you go. But what did you tell the lions?" He said, "I told them to be speeches after dinner." So with that as a warning, I do want to make a very, very short speech. But I do have to explain something. There's a little bit of a misunderstanding here in this party. Because when Marty came to me, she said, "We should have a party for that big 7-0. And I said, "Yeah, 007, that's a good party, that's a great idea." Because, 007 and I, we have a lot in common. We each, our name is 3 characters in each case, 007, H-A-L, I mean, that's common. 007, he has Miss Moneypenny to keep him out of trouble. I have Penny too, wherever she is, she keeps me out of trouble. To the best of her ability, I have to say, because it's a pretty tough job. And finally, 007, he always works with these beautiful models. I'm an economist, I work with models. So, we've got all these things in common, and you would think it would make a lot of sense. And it's only later I realized, no, it wasn't 007, it was this 7-0 thing. But anyway, when I went to order the cake, the nice lady said, "Do you want anything on it?" And I said, "Yeah, well, what do you recommend?" She says, "Well, how about Happy Birthday, Hal?" And I said, "Oh, well, that's pretty creative. I mean, that really fits the bill. It's elegant in its simplicity." But then she said, "But you have to come up with something for the second cake." So the second cake, what would you do? Finally, I had an inspiration. I said, "Why don't you put on it, 'I'm feeling lucky.' I'm feeling lucky." Not only is it the Google motto or Google symbol or Google phrase, but I think it's true for my life, because all my life I've had a series of really fantastic lucky things happening to me, going to MIT and Berkeley, teaching at these great universities around the world, working at Google, watching it grow. My lovely wife, Carol, and my family. These have really been great strokes of good fortune. And one of the luckiest things that's really happened to me is having all of you as friends. So it's been really fantastic for me, and thanks all of you for being part of my life and for coming to this event. And I want to give special thanks to Eric Schmidt. As you just saw, he was really the inspiration behind this. And I want to give special thanks to Marty, because it was Marty's conception, and I know she's worked very hard to pull it together, and the organization's been fantastic. In fact, you can actually organize my 71st birthday party. That would be great too. You know, it's much harder, you think, sitting there listening to people say things about you, whether they're not nice things or nice things. It's hard even if they're nice things. But I figured maybe if we do this, 6 or 7 more times, I'll get used to it. And then it won't be so hard the next time. So anyway, thank you so much for coming. Enjoy the cake. It's fantastic cake. Have a safe journey home. Thanks again for this event.
Happy St. Patty's Day! At Google!